On the eve of the 20th century, the world believed it already knew how history worked. Power flowed in one direction. Industry, science, and modern warfare belonged to Europe. The rest of the world, Africa, much of Asia, the islands of the Caribbean, was expected to bend, adapt, or disappear. By the 1890s, this belief had hardened into near certainty. Maps told the story clearly enough. Vast regions were colored red, blue, or tricolor, marked as possessions of empires that stretched across oceans. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships connected imperial capitals to distant frontiers. European officers wrote confidently of progress, civilization, and destiny, convinced that resistance was temporary and defeat inevitable. Africa, in particular, was treated as a solved problem. In little more than a decade, nearly the entire continent had been partitioned by foreign powers. Armies equipped with repeating rifles, machine guns, and artillery had crushed resistance after resistance. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries collapsed in a matter of weeks. Leaders who attempted diplomacy were absorbed through treaties they did not fully control. Those who chose war were overwhelmed by firepower they could not match. By the mid-1890s, European newspapers spoke openly of Africa as a completed chapter, a land finally brought into the modern world through conquest. Yet beneath this confident narrative lay a quieter truth. The European empires were not as unified or as invincible as they appeared. Their rivalries were intense. Their ambitions often outpaced their resources, and their understanding of the societies they sought to control was frequently shallow, shaped more by prejudice than by reality. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the Horn of Africa, where one ancient state had watched the colonial advance with unusual clarity. Ethiopia did not see itself as a frontier. It saw itself as a civilization. Its written history stretched back millennia. Its rulers traced legitimacy through lineage, religion, and conquest long before European nation-states existed in their modern form. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had shaped identity and governance since late antiquity, binding faith to sovereignty in ways outsiders rarely understood. Power within the empire was decentralized, but not chaotic, distributed among regional leaders whose loyalty was negotiated rather than assumed. This system created internal tension, but it also produced resilience. Ethiopia did not collapse when challenged. It adapted. By the late 19th century, Ethiopia stood almost alone. Liberia remained formally independent, but its survival depended on American protection. Ethiopia, by contrast, existed without a patron. Its independence was not granted or tolerated. It was defended. European diplomats knew this, even if their newspapers did not. They recognized that Ethiopia possessed something rare in Africa at the height of imperial expansion: population depth, political legitimacy, and a ruling elite capable of strategic thinking beyond immediate survival. Still, most assumed it was only a matter of time. Modern wars, they believed, could not be won by pre-industrial societies. Discipline, technology, and organization would always prevail. European officers had fought Africans before. They knew how these wars ended, or so they thought. Italy entered this world with something to prove. Unified only decades earlier, it was the youngest of the European powers and the most insecure. Britain and France possessed vast empires. Germany had announced itself through force. Italy, by comparison, lagged behind, economically, militarily, and psychologically. Colonial expansion offered a solution. An overseas empire promised prestige, resources, and proof that Italy belonged among the great powers. The Horn of Africa appeared to offer exactly what Italy needed. A foothold already existed along the Red Sea coast. The interior seemed rugged but conquerable. European racial theory dismissed African resistance as emotional rather than strategic, brave perhaps, but ultimately ineffective. Italy's political leadership embraced these assumptions eagerly. Ethiopia, they believed, would fall like the rest. What made this belief dangerous was not simply arrogance, but misunderstanding. Ethiopia was not a fragmented collection of tribes reacting impulsively to foreign intrusion. It was a state watching, learning, and preparing. While European powers congratulated themselves on dividing Africa, Ethiopian leadership studied the pattern behind those divisions. They saw how treaties became traps, how delays became encirclement, how isolated resistance invited destruction, and they reached a conclusion few others had. Survival required time, unity, and modern tools. This was the world before the shock, a world where Europe expected obedience and received it, where African victories were remembered as curiosities, not warnings, where colonial armies marched with confidence, believing the outcome was already decided. In this world, Italy prepared to assert its place in history through conquest, and Ethiopia prepared to defend its existence through calculation. Neither side yet understood how completely those expectations were about to collapse. In the winter of 1884, far from the mountains and plateaus of Africa, a different kind of battle was taking place. It unfolded not with rifles or cavalry, but with maps, ink, and quiet certainty. In a conference room in Berlin, representatives of Europe's most powerful states gathered around long tables, their attention fixed on a continent most of them had never seen. The meeting would later be remembered as the Berlin Conference, but at the time it was understood simply as administration, a way to prevent European powers from fighting each other while they divided the rest of the world. No Africans were invited. None were consulted. The future of hundreds of millions of people was discussed as a technical problem, not a moral one. Rivers became borders. Mountains became lines of convenience. Regions with complex political histories were flattened into blank spaces waiting to be claimed. The assumption underlying every conversation was absolute. Europe possessed the right to rule, and Africa existed to be organized. Britain claimed vast territories stretching from the Cape toward the Nile, envisioning a continuous corridor of imperial control. France expanded aggressively across West and North Africa, linking Atlantic ports to Mediterranean ambitions. Germany, newly unified and eager to assert itself, staked claims in strategic regions. Belgium's King Leopold II secured personal control over the Congo Basin, a decision that would soon result in one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. Portugal and Spain, weakened but persistent, extended older coastal holdings inland. Italy arrived late and empty-handed. Its representatives watched as others carved away the most valuable territories. What remained was politically complex, geographically difficult, and already inhabited by societies unwilling to surrender quietly. For Italy, however, this was not a warning. It was an opportunity. To succeed where others hesitated would prove Italian strength. To conquer a land others found difficult would erase doubts about Italy's place among empires. From a European perspective, the conference solved a problem. It created rules for colonization that favored speed and recognition over legitimacy. A power that occupied territory and informed others of its claim would be protected from interference. This agreement, designed to prevent war between European states, ignored the fact that war was being imposed everywhere else. African sovereignty did not matter unless a European power recognized it. Ethiopia observed these developments with unease. Though not represented, it was not ignorant. News traveled through diplomatic channels, missionaries, traders, and envoys. Ethiopian leaders understood that the conference signaled shift. Colonization was no longer opportunistic. It was systematic. The rules of engagement had changed, and survival now required understanding those rules. Unlike many African polities, Ethiopia was not facing European pressure for the first time. Foreign traders and emissaries had arrived for centuries. Portuguese envoys had visited the Ethiopian court as early as the 16th century. Catholic missionaries had attempted conversion. Muslim sultanates had contested borders. Ethiopia had endured, not through isolation, but through selective engagement. It adopted what it needed, resisted what it rejected, and remained wary of external influence. What the Berlin Conference made clear was that neutrality was no longer an option. European powers now believed they had legal authority to claim African land, whether its inhabitants agreed or not. A kingdom that failed to assert itself diplomatically risked being labeled unclaimed, even if it possessed an army, a history, and a ruler. Italy moved quickly. In 1885, it established a formal foothold along the Red Sea coast, occupying the port of Massawa. The move was framed as protection of trade routes, but its strategic purpose was obvious. Control of the coast provided access inland, and inland lay Ethiopia. Italian officials described their new territory as Eritrea, presenting it as a natural extension of Italian influence rather than a colonial intrusion. From there, military planners began to look south. To Italian eyes, Ethiopia appeared divided. Regional leaders competed for influence. Succession disputes had weakened past emperors. European observers interpreted this decentralization as dysfunction. They did not see the underlying structure that allowed Ethiopian rulers to mobilize loyalty when survival was at stake. They assumed internal rivalry would prevent coordinated resistance, as it had elsewhere in Africa. What they failed to grasp was that Ethiopia's political culture was not built on permanent unity, but on conditional alliance. Regional lords resisted centralized authority in peacetime, but rallied to it when foreign domination threatened the entire system. This distinction mattered, and Italy did not understand it until it was too late. The lines drawn in Berlin were invisible on the ground, but their consequences were not. European patrols crossed borders that had never existed before. Treaties were drafted in foreign languages and enforced at gunpoint. Colonial logic transformed ambiguity into weakness and patience into vulnerability. In this new world, Ethiopia's continued independence was no longer tolerated as an anomaly. It was seen as unfinished business. By the late 1880s, the direction of events was clear. Italy would not be satisfied with a coastal enclave. Ethiopia would not be left alone. And somewhere between European certainty and Ethiopian calculation, a collision was forming, one that would test whether the assumptions made in Berlin could survive contact with reality. Long before Italy turned its ambitions southward, Ethiopia itself was in turmoil. The empire of the mid-19th century was not the unified state it would later become, but a patchwork of competing regions bound loosely by tradition, faith, and memory. This period was known as the Zemin Mesafint, the era of princes, a time when emperors ruled in name while real power lay in the hands of regional warlords. Alliances shifted constantly. Wars were frequent. Authority was fragile. For a child born into this world, survival required caution, adaptability, and an instinct for power. It was into this fractured Ethiopia that Salamarium was born in 1844 in the region of Shua. He was the son of a local ruler with imperial blood, but limited reach. And from an early age, he learned that lineage alone did not guarantee security. When his father was defeated by a rival emperor, Salamarium was captured and taken to the imperial court as a hostage. For most children, captivity would have meant humiliation and fear. For him, it became an education. For nearly a decade, he lived at the center of imperial politics, observing the rituals of power from a position of enforced stillness. He watched emperors rise and fall. He listened to negotiations conducted in whispers. He saw how force and legitimacy interacted, how religion sanctified authority, and how impatience destroyed it. Most importantly, he learned restraint. While others rushed toward power and were cut down, Salamarium waited. When he finally escaped and returned to Shua in the mid-1860s, he did not attempt immediate revenge or reckless expansion. Instead, he focused on consolidation. Shua was not the strongest region in Ethiopia, but it was well-positioned geographically and commercially. Salamarium built alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and selective warfare. Over time, he transformed Shua from a vulnerable province into a dominant power base. This transformation was not driven by tradition alone. Salamarium understood that the world beyond Ethiopia was changing rapidly. European traders brought not only goods, but information. Firearms, once rare, and unreliable, were becoming standardized and deadly. Railways and telegraphs were shrinking distances. States that failed to modernize were being absorbed by those that did. Salamarium paid attention. He began importing modern rifles in significant numbers, purchasing them from European suppliers willing to trade with anyone who could pay. Unlike other Ethiopian leaders who treated firearms as prestige items, he integrated them systematically into his forces. Training emphasized discipline and coordination. Traditional weapons were retained, but no longer relied upon exclusively. Warfare, he understood, had become a science as much as an art. At the same time, Salamarium cultivated relationships with European powers without binding himself to any single one. He welcomed diplomats, missionaries, and traders, offering access while maintaining control. He studied how Europeans negotiated among themselves, how alliances shifted, and how rivalries could be exploited. This was not admiration. It was analysis. By the time Emperor Johannes IV died in battle in 1889, Salamarium was ready. At 45, he claimed the imperial throne, taking the name Menelik II. The title he assumed, King of Kings, Elect of God, carried immense symbolic weight, but Menelik understood that symbolism without strength invited destruction. He inherited an empire surrounded by predators and fractured within. His reign would be defined by whether he could turn potential into permanence. Menelik's first priority was legitimacy. He confirmed the privileges of regional leaders rather than stripping them away. He distributed titles strategically, ensuring loyalty without provoking rebellion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a pillar of national identity, was strengthened as a unifying force. Faith became not only a spiritual bond, but a political one, reinforcing the idea that Ethiopia's sovereignty was divinely sanctioned. His second priority was time. Menelik knew Ethiopia was not yet ready to confront a European power directly. Its army was large, but unevenly equipped. Its regions were cooperative, but not fully integrated. Its infrastructure remained limited. War would come, but not yet. Until then, Menelik needed breathing room. Italy unknowingly provided it. When Italian diplomats approached Menelik with offers of friendship, recognition, and material support, he listened carefully. A treaty could buy time. It could bring weapons and international acknowledgement. It could delay confrontation while Ethiopia prepared. Menelik did not reject European diplomacy out of pride. He used it as a tool. What Italy believed was a moment of advantage was, for Menelik, another lesson in patience. He had learned long ago that power rarely announced itself honestly. Those who survived were those who waited, watched, and chose their moment carefully. And as Menelik settled into the imperial throne, that moment was drawing closer than anyone in Rome yet realized. Diplomacy in the age of empire was rarely transparent, and treaties were often weapons disguised as agreements. In 1889, as Menelik II consolidated his rule, Italy moved quickly to secure what it believed would be a decisive advantage. A new emperor, European officials assumed, would be vulnerable, eager for recognition, anxious to stabilize his throne, and willing to trade sovereignty for support. Italy presented itself not as a conqueror, but as a partner. The proposal appeared reasonable on the surface. Italy would recognize Menelik as Emperor of Ethiopia. It would provide financial assistance and modern weapons. Borders between Ethiopia and Italian-controlled Eritrea would be formally defined. In return, Ethiopia would agree to a treaty of friendship and cooperation. For Menelik, the offer promised exactly what he needed most: time, arms, and diplomatic legitimacy. On May 2nd, 1889, the Treaty of Wuchel was signed. The document existed in two official versions, one in Amharic, Ethiopia's state language, and one in Italian. At first glance, they appeared identical. The articles outlined mutual respect, trade privileges, and diplomatic procedures. But buried within the text was a single clause whose wording would determine the future of Ethiopia. Article 17. In the Amharic version, the language was permissive. It stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia may choose to use Italian diplomatic channels when communicating with other European powers, should he wish to do so. It was optional, a courtesy extended between friendly states. Menelik interpreted it as such. In the Italian version, the wording was transformed. The clause stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy. This subtle shift from choice to obligation changed everything. Under international law, as understood by European powers, this language reclassified Ethiopia as an Italian protectorate. Its foreign policy would no longer be sovereign. Italy could speak on Ethiopia's behalf. Ethiopia would exist, but only within limits defined in Rome. Italy did not immediately reveal its interpretation. Instead, it acted quietly. Italian diplomats informed other European governments that Ethiopia had accepted protectorate status. Newspapers began referring to the region as part of Italian East Africa. When Ethiopian envoys attempted to engage directly with foreign courts, they were blocked or ignored. Italy, invoking the treaty, claimed exclusive authority. At first, Menelik did not recognize the full implications. The treaty delivered what it promised in the short term. Shipments of modern rifles arrived, tens of thousands of them. Diplomatic recognition followed. European governments acknowledged Menelik's title. The empire gained valuable breathing space. For a time, it appeared the agreement had worked. Then the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Italian forces in Eritrea began pushing beyond agreed borders, establishing new forts and garrisons deeper inland. Ethiopian protests were dismissed as misunderstandings. When Menelik sent representatives to negotiate trade agreements in Rome, they were refused an audience. Italian officials declared that Ethiopia, as a protectorate, could not conduct independent diplomacy. That word, protectorate, was the moment of clarity. Menelik ordered both versions of the treaty brought before him. Side by side, the deception was undeniable. This was not a translation error. It was deliberate. Italy had attempted to colonize Ethiopia without firing a shot, using legal language as its weapon. Menelik's response was not immediate anger, but controlled resolve. Years of political survival had taught him that outrage without leverage achieved nothing. Instead, he began a calculated counteroffensive. Letters were drafted to European monarchs and governments. Copies of both treaty versions were enclosed. The discrepancy was explained calmly, precisely, without threats. The reaction in Europe was mixed. Some officials acknowledged the deception privately, but hesitated to challenge Italy openly. Others dismissed Ethiopian complaints as irrelevant. Africa, after all, was not expected to argue international law. For 3 years, Menelik pursued diplomacy. He proposed renegotiation. He appealed to fairness. He sought compromise that preserved Ethiopian sovereignty while maintaining peaceful relations. Italy refused every offer. The protectorate claim was central to its colonial ambitions, and abandoning it would mean humiliation before rival powers. By 1893, Menelik concluded that the treaty could not be salvaged. On February 12th of that year, he sent a letter directly to King Umberto I of Italy. The message was unambiguous. The Treaty of Wuchel was null and void. Ethiopia rejected protectorate status. Its independence was not negotiable. With that declaration, diplomacy ended and the path to war opened. Italy now faced a choice. It could accept the annulment and retreat with its prestige bruised but intact, or it could attempt to enforce its claim through force. In Rome, political pressure made the decision inevitable. Backing down from an African state was unthinkable. National pride, already fragile, demanded action. What Italy failed to understand was that the treaty it believed had weakened Ethiopia had done the opposite. It had bought Menelik years of preparation. It had delivered weapons, legitimacy, and time. And by revealing Italy's intentions so clearly, it had ensured that when conflict came, Ethiopia would fight not as a divided empire, but as a nation defending its survival. The illusion of control created by ink and paper was about to be tested against reality. The annulment of the Treaty of Wuchel landed in Rome like a public insult. For years, Italian politicians and newspapers had spoken confidently of Ethiopia as a protectorate in all but name. Maps were printed. Speeches were delivered. Colonial ambition had been woven into national pride. To accept Menelik's rejection now would mean admitting that Italy had been outmaneuvered by an African emperor, a humiliation no European power believed it could afford. Italy's internal politics made compromise impossible. The country was restless. Economic inequality, regional divisions, and fragile governments plagued the young state. Colonial expansion had become more than a foreign policy objective. It was a domestic distraction, a way to unite the public behind the promise of national greatness. Ethiopia was no longer just a target. It was a test of Italy's identity. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi stood at the center of this storm. A fervent nationalist, Crispi believed deeply in Italy's destiny as a Mediterranean empire. He saw colonial conquest as proof that Italy had finally joined the ranks of Europe's great powers. To retreat now, especially under pressure from an African ruler, would shatter that narrative. Political survival demanded escalation. Italian military assessments reinforced Crispi's confidence. Reports described Ethiopian forces as brave but unsophisticated, numerous but poorly coordinated. Their weapons were assumed to be outdated, their logistics primitive. Italian officers trained in European warfare believed discipline and firepower would decide any confrontation quickly. The memory of earlier colonial victories elsewhere in Africa encouraged complacency. The plan was simple. Italy would assert its claim from its base in Eritrea, advance inland, and force Ethiopia to submit. A decisive show of force would restore prestige and secure a vast colonial possession in the Horn of Africa. Few in Rome questioned whether Ethiopia might be preparing for this very scenario. General Oreste Baratieri was placed in command of Italian forces in East Africa. A seasoned colonial officer, Baratieri had experience fighting indigenous forces and understood the challenges of terrain and supply. Initially, he favored caution. He recognized that Ethiopia was not an easy target and that overextension could be dangerous. But military prudence meant little in the face of political pressure. Throughout 1894 and 1895, Italy poured resources into Eritrea. Thousands of troops were shipped from Europe. Roads were built, supply depots established, artillery and ammunition stockpiled. The Italian army in Africa grew steadily, transforming what had been a coastal occupation into a forward operating force capable of sustained inland campaigns. As Italian forces pushed southward, they tested Ethiopian responses. Border forts were seized. Patrols advanced deeper into contested territory. Each move was intended to provoke a reaction, to draw Menelik into battle before Ethiopia could fully mobilize. Each time, Menelik refused to be baited. Instead of rushing to confront the Italians, Ethiopian forces withdrew strategically, avoiding decisive engagements while harassing supply lines and gathering intelligence. Scouts tracked Italian movements. Messengers carried reports back to the imperial court. Menelik watched, measured, and waited. What Italy interpreted as weakness was, in reality, preparation. Menelik understood that a European army could not be defeated by courage alone. Victory would require numbers, yes, but also coordination, logistics, and modern firepower used intelligently. He also understood that Ethiopia's greatest vulnerability was internal division. If regional leaders acted independently, Italy could defeat them one by one. Unity was not optional. It was existential. The call to arms went out quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Messengers traveled across the empire. Churches became centers of communication. Regional leaders were summoned to council. Menelik framed the conflict not as a dispute over borders or treaties, but as a struggle for Ethiopia's survival. Submission, he warned, would mean the end of sovereignty, faith, and tradition. Some leaders hesitated. Old rivalries died slowly. Others joined immediately, recognizing the scale of the threat. Menelik negotiated, persuaded, and promised autonomy where necessary. But unity required more than diplomacy. It required belief. That belief was reinforced by a figure whose influence matched the moment. Empress Teta Batul was not content to remain a symbolic presence. Fiercely intelligent and deeply skeptical of European intentions, she rejected compromise outright. To her, the pattern was clear. Every African kingdom that trusted colonial promises had been destroyed. Ethiopia, she insisted, must resist fully and decisively. Teta acted where words were insufficient. She traveled to wavering regions, using family ties and political skill to bring hesitant leaders into the coalition. She helped organize supply networks, coordinated logistics, and ensured that mobilization was not merely symbolic. When armies began to move, she moved with them. By late 1895, Ethiopia was transforming. What had once been a collection of regional forces was becoming a national army. Tens of thousands of warriors gathered from across the empire, bringing weapons, supplies, and resolve. Modern rifles stood alongside traditional arms. Cavalry units trained for rapid movement. Artillery, purchased quietly from European rivals, was positioned for use. Italy, watching this build-up, began to sense that something was wrong. Intelligence reports grew more alarming. Ethiopian forces were not scattering. They were concentrating. They were organized. They were patient. Baratieri urged caution, arguing that time favored Italy. Ethiopia's massive army, he believed, could not sustain itself indefinitely. Supply shortages would force it to disperse. But Rome had lost patience. Newspapers mocked hesitation. Politicians demanded action. Victory, they insisted, must come quickly. By the end of 1895, the road to war was irreversible. Italy had committed its prestige. Ethiopia had committed its survival. Both sides believed they understood what was coming. Only one of them was right. Mobilizing an army is one thing. Sustaining it is another entirely. By late 1895, Ethiopia was attempting something no African state had ever achieved on such a scale. The coordinated movement, supply, and command of a force approaching 100,000 warriors across vast and unforgiving terrain. This was not a professional standing army supported by railroads and depots. It was a nation in motion. Menelik understood that the greatest danger now was not Italian firepower, but Ethiopian collapse under its own weight. Every soldier required food. Every rifle required ammunition. Every regional force brought not only fighters, but families, servants, livestock, and supplies. The marching columns stretched for miles. Camps became temporary cities. Without discipline, the mobilization could dissolve into chaos. The solution lay in structure without rigidity. Regional leaders retained command over their own forces, preserving traditional authority and loyalty. But strategy flowed from the center. Menelik established a clear chain of coordination, assigning sectors, objectives, and lines of communication. Runners carried orders. Scouts mapped terrain and enemy movement. Priests reinforced morale, framing the struggle as both national defense and sacred duty. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a decisive role. Its networks reached into every region. Sermons framed the war as a defense of faith against foreign domination. This was not abstract ideology. European colonialism elsewhere had brought forced conversions, cultural erasure, and a subjugation of churches. Ethiopians understood what defeat could mean. Faith became fuel. Logistics were managed with ruthless pragmatism. Supply depots were established along major routes. Livestock moved with the armies, providing food on the march. Grain was requisitioned in advance, with promises of compensation later. Teta Batul oversaw much of this effort personally, ensuring that supplies reached the front and that regional commanders remained aligned with imperial strategy. Her presence was not ceremonial. Italian intelligence reports noted her movements with growing concern. As Ethiopian forces concentrated in the north near the frontier with Italian-controlled Eritrea, the scale of the mobilization became impossible to hide. Scouts reported Italian troop movements daily. Italian patrols encountered Ethiopian cavalry probing their positions. The battlefield was forming long before the first shots were fired. General Baratieri now faced a dilemma. His original assumption, That Ethiopia would fracture under pressure was proving false. The Ethiopian army was not dispersing. It was growing stronger. But his own forces were stretched thin. Supply lines from the coast were long and vulnerable. Reinforcements from Italy took months to arrive. His army was well armed, but not large enough to match Ethiopia in numbers. Baratieri proposed a strategy of delay. He believed that time favored Italy. Feeding and coordinating such a massive Ethiopian force would eventually become impossible. Hunger, desertion, and internal rivalry would weaken Menelik's army without a major battle. But this strategy required patience, and patience was in short supply in Rome. Political pressure intensified. Prime Minister Crispi demanded results. Newspapers accused Baratieri of cowardice. Parliament debated his replacement. Victory was expected, not explanations. Baratieri understood what this meant. His career, his reputation, and his honor were at stake. He could not retreat. He could not wait indefinitely. He would have to fight. Menelik, watching these developments, recognized the shift. Italian movements grew more aggressive. Fortifications were reinforced. Artillery repositioned. Ethiopia's window was closing. The army could not remain concentrated forever without draining the countryside. Delay now favored Italy, not Ethiopia. In December 1895, Menelik made his first decisive move. Ethiopian forces advanced on Italian positions at Amba Alajai, a strategic mountain stronghold guarding key approaches. The garrison was isolated and heavily outnumbered. Ethiopian commanders surrounded the position methodically, cutting off supply routes and maintaining pressure without reckless assault. Weeks passed. Italian relief forces failed to arrive. When the garrison finally surrendered, the shock was immediate and profound. European troops surrendering to African forces was almost unthinkable. Thousands of Italian and colonial soldiers became prisoners. Word spread quickly through both camps. Ethiopian morale surged. Italian confidence cracked. Menelik did not pause. In January 1896, Ethiopian forces moved against another fortified position at Mekelle. This siege was more complex. The Italian garrison was larger, better supplied, and commanded by determined officers. Ethiopian artillery, purchased from Russia and trained discreetly, proved its worth. Shells landed accurately. Water supplies were cut. The message was unmistakable. Ethiopia was not improvising. It was executing a plan. When the Mekelle garrison surrendered, Menelik made a choice that stunned observers. The Italian soldiers were allowed to withdraw, stripped of weapons but alive. The decision was strategic, not merciful. These defeated troops carried stories back to Eritrea, of vast Ethiopian armies, effective artillery, disciplined command, and leaders who understood European warfare. Fear spread faster than any proclamation. By early February 1896, the balance had shifted. Italy had lost key positions without inflicting serious damage. Ethiopian forces were intact, confident, and unified. Baratieri knew that his opportunity to dictate terms was gone. On February 8th, a telegram arrived from Rome. Its message was brief and unforgiving. Secure a decisive victory immediately or be replaced. Baratieri now faced the moment he had hoped to avoid. He would march south. He would seek battle. And he would stake everything on the belief that European firepower could still overcome Ethiopian unity. Menelik, reading the terrain and the signals, understood exactly what this meant. The war was about to be decided. By the final days of February 1896, both sides understood that delay was no longer an option. The Italian army could not remain entrenched in Eritrea without losing credibility, and the Ethiopian host could not sustain a prolonged standoff without draining the countryside that supported it. The difference was that one side was choosing the moment, while the other was being forced into it. General Orest Baratieri knew the risks. His army numbered roughly 20,000 men, about 15,000 Italian regulars, and the rest Eritrean askari serving under Italian command. They were well equipped by European standards. They carried modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. They were trained, uniformed, and supplied. On paper, they represented the cutting edge of 19th century warfare. But paper did not capture terrain, morale, or intelligence. Baratieri's greatest weakness was not numbers alone, but uncertainty. He did not know precisely where Menelik's main force was positioned, only that it was somewhere near the hills surrounding the town of Adwa. Italian maps of the region were inaccurate and incomplete. Mountain passes were mislabeled. Distances were underestimated. Valleys that appeared navigable on paper were narrow, steep, and exposed. Ethiopian scouts, by contrast, knew every ridge, path, and ravine. Still, political pressure left Baratieri with little choice. To withdraw would mean disgrace. To wait longer would mean removal. He convinced himself that speed and surprise could compensate for uncertainty. If he could strike quickly, before Ethiopian forces fully consolidated, he might break their cohesion and force Menelik into retreat. The plan he approved was ambitious to the point of recklessness. The Italian army would march at night, moving south from its forward positions toward Adwa. The force would be divided into 4 brigades, each advancing along a separate mountain route. At dawn, the columns were supposed to converge near the Ethiopian positions, forming a unified front that could deliver a decisive blow. Italian artillery would dominate the battlefield. Coordinated infantry advances would shatter Ethiopian formations. The battle, Baratieri believed, would be won before Ethiopian numbers could be brought to bear. What the plan required was precision. What the terrain ensured was confusion. On the night of February 29th, Italian columns began moving in darkness. The march was slow and exhausting. Soldiers navigated narrow paths, stumbling over rocks and uneven ground. Units stretched out as men struggled to maintain pace. Communication between columns was minimal. Orders were carried by runners who frequently lost their way or arrived too late. Unbeknownst to the Italians, Ethiopian scouts were shadowing them the entire time. Small, mobile units moved silently along parallel ridges, watching, counting, and reporting. Runners carried updates back to Menelik throughout the night. By the time Italian forces believed they were approaching an unsuspecting enemy, their movements were fully known. Menelik did not need to improvise. He had anticipated this moment. Ethiopian forces had already been positioned across the high ground surrounding Adwa in a broad crescent formation. Regional armies occupied specific sectors, each under commanders who understood both the plan and the terrain. Artillery was placed on elevated positions with clear fields of fire. Cavalry units waited in reserve, ready to exploit openings or cut off retreat. As dawn approached on March 1st, 1896, the Italian columns were no longer aligned as intended. The distances between brigades were far greater than planned. Some units had advanced too far. Others lagged behind. Instead of forming a coordinated line, the Italian army was scattered across valleys and slopes, vulnerable and isolated. When the first light revealed the Ethiopian positions, Italian officers experienced a moment of disbelief. The hills were alive with movement. Tens of thousands of warriors stood in formation, banners visible, artillery prepared. This was not a dispersed force caught off guard. It was an army waiting. Retreat was still possible, but only in theory. The narrow mountain paths behind the Italian columns were already congested. Turning back under pressure would mean disorder. And psychologically, retreat at the moment of contact was unthinkable. Pride and momentum pushed the Italians forward. The first shots were fired shortly after dawn as Italian advance units made contact with Ethiopian forward positions. What followed was not a single battle, but several unfolding simultaneously, each shaped by terrain, timing, and the choices of individual commanders. Baratieri, positioned with reserve forces, struggled to understand what was happening. Reports were fragmentary. Columns that were supposed to support one another were fighting independently. Runners took hours to traverse distances that maps suggested were minutes apart. The battlefield was already slipping beyond centralized control. Menelik, observing from elevated ground, saw the pattern immediately. The Italian army was divided. Its flanks were exposed. Its columns were vulnerable to encirclement. The trap had closed. What would follow was not a test of bravery, but of preparation. The assumptions carried from Europe into the Ethiopian highlands were about to be dismantled, ridge by ridge, brigade by brigade. The Battle of Adwa did not begin with a single thunderous clash. It began in fragments, isolated shots echoing through valleys, scattered volleys cracking against rock, confused orders shouted into thin mountain air. By the time the sun fully crested the horizon on March 1st, 1896, the Italian army was already fighting a battle it did not understand. The first major contact occurred as Italian advance units pushed into Ethiopian forward positions shortly after dawn. Expecting light resistance, they instead encountered disciplined fire from elevated ground. Ethiopian riflemen, positioned along ridges and behind natural cover, fired deliberately, conserving ammunition and targeting officers and artillery crews. Italian soldiers, trained to advance in formation, found themselves exposed on open slopes, their movements clearly visible to defenders above. Almost immediately, the problem of separation became critical. The four Italian brigades were not where they were supposed to be. The terrain had distorted distance and direction. Valleys twisted unexpectedly. Ridges blocked sight lines. Units advanced believing support was nearby, only to discover themselves alone under fire. On the Italian right, General Vittorio de Bormida's brigade marched deeper into a narrow valley, convinced it was maneuvering to outflank Ethiopian positions. In reality, Ethiopian forces were closing around him. Warriors occupied the surrounding heights, holding their fire and allowing the column to advance further into the trap. De Bormida, relying on flawed maps, did not realize his danger until it was too late. In the center, Italian brigades under Generals Matteo Albertone and Giuseppe Aramondi made direct contact with the main Ethiopian force. These were not skirmishers or irregulars. They were veteran formations drawn from northern Ethiopia, men who had fought Italians before and understood their tactics. Ethiopian artillery opened fire from the high ground, shells landing with unnerving accuracy among Italian ranks. The shock was immediate. European soldiers had not expected to face effective artillery operated by African forces. Italian guns responded, their shells tearing through Ethiopian formations and inflicting real damage. The battlefield became a cacophony of sound. Rifle fire cracking continuously, artillery booming, shouted commands echoing across hillsides. Smoke hung low in the morning air, partially obscuring movement and adding to the confusion. Despite their training, Italian units struggled to adapt. European doctrine emphasized linear formations and coordinated volleys, effective on open fields but vulnerable in broken terrain. Ethiopian forces advanced and withdrew fluidly, using rocks, gullies, and slopes to appear, fire, and disappear. Fire came from multiple directions at once, creating the impression of encirclement even before it was complete. Menelik observed calmly. He did not rush his forces forward recklessly. Ethiopian commanders had been instructed to hold positions, inflict damage, and wait for the Italians to overextend. Ammunition was precious. Every shot mattered. The objective was not immediate annihilation, but gradual destabilization. By mid-morning, the strain on the Italian center was evident. Albertone's brigade was absorbing heavy casualties. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion as Ethiopian units pressed closer, tightening the noose. Attempts to reposition artillery were hampered by terrain and constant fire. Communication between brigades deteriorated further as runners were killed or delayed. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the battle reached its first decisive turning point. Albert I realized his brigade was in danger of being surrounded. He ordered a withdrawal to more defensible ground. Under normal circumstances, such a maneuver might have been orderly. Under fire, in broken terrain, it became chaotic. As Italian units began pulling back, Ethiopian cavalry moved. Horsemen surged forward from concealed positions, accelerating downhill with terrifying speed. These were not ceremonial riders. Ethiopian cavalry were trained from childhood in mounted combat, capable of fighting with rifles, swords, and spears. They struck at the moment Italian formations lost cohesion, crashing into flanks and rear units already shaken by sustained fire. Close combat followed. European soldiers, trained primarily for ranged engagements, suddenly found themselves face to face with warriors wielding blades with lethal skill. The battlefield dissolved into violence at arm's length. Shouts replaced orders. Survival replaced strategy. Albertone's brigade began to collapse. By around 8 a.m., the Italian center had ceased to function as an organized force. Thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Albert I himself was taken prisoner. Ethiopian forces pressed forward, not in a wild charge, but in controlled waves, ensuring that escape routes were sealed. Yet even as one Italian brigade disintegrated, others continued to fight, unaware of the scale of disaster unfolding nearby. De Bormida's column on the right was now fully engaged, and his situation was worse than Albertone's. Surrounded on three sides, De Bormida attempted to force a breakout. Ethiopian forces opened fire simultaneously from surrounding heights, creating a devastating crossfire. Italian artillery crews were targeted and overrun. Infantry units were shredded as they attempted to form defensive squares on uneven ground that offered no protection. The brigade fought desperately. Small groups held out behind rocks and in shallow depressions. Officers rallied men repeatedly, only to fall under concentrated fire. Ethiopian forces advanced steadily, exploiting their numerical advantage and cutting the column into isolated pockets. By mid-morning, De Bormida's brigade was being annihilated. General Aramondi's forces in the center-left continued to resist with determination. Italian artillery inflicted serious Ethiopian casualties, temporarily halting advances. But ammunition was dwindling, and the psychological impact of seeing neighboring brigades destroyed could not be ignored. Ethiopian forces pressed harder, sensing the moment approaching. Throughout this chaos, Empress Tedu remained active near the center, overseeing logistics and ensuring ammunition reached frontline units. Italian prisoners later spoke of her presence with disbelief, struggling to reconcile their expectations with the reality of a woman directing operations on a major battlefield. By late morning, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Italian units that attempted retreat were pursued relentlessly. Ethiopian cavalry cut down fleeing soldiers. Artillery fire targeted congested withdrawal routes. What began as an organized advance had become a collapse spreading across the entire front. General Baratieri, watching events unfold from his position with the reserves, understood the truth too late. His army was destroyed in detail. There was no decisive blow to deliver, no line to reform behind. The assumptions carried from Europe about discipline, superiority, inevitability were dissolving in blood and dust. By noon, the Battle of Adwa was effectively over. What remained was not a contest of arms, but the consequences of belief meeting reality and losing. By the time the sun reached its highest point over the mountains of Adwa, the Italian army no longer existed as a coherent force. What remained were fragments, isolated groups of exhausted soldiers stumbling northward, wounded men lying among rocks and dust, and pockets of resistance slowly being overwhelmed. The battlefield stretched across miles of broken terrain, marked by shattered equipment, abandoned artillery, and the bodies of men who had marched in a history believing victory was assured. General de Bormida's brigade had ceased to exist. Of the thousands who had entered the valley at dawn, only a handful escaped. De Bormida himself was dead, whether killed in combat or by his own hand to avoid capture would never be definitively known. The annihilation of his column was total, and its destruction sealed the fate of the entire campaign. In the center, the remnants of General Aramondi's forces fought desperately to slow the Ethiopian advance. Discipline held longer here than anywhere else. Italian soldiers maintained volley fire under extreme pressure, their training evident even in defeat. Artillery continued firing until ammunition ran out or crews were cut down. But courage could not compensate for isolation. With flanks exposed and no reserves to call upon, resistance gradually collapsed. Aramondi was killed attempting to rally his men. His death marked the final breaking point. Units dissolved into disorder. Weapons were thrown aside to lighten the burden of flight. Officers lost authority as survival instincts took over. Ethiopian cavalry surged forward, cutting off escape routes and driving the retreat into chaos. Only one Italian brigade avoided immediate destruction. Positioned on the far left, it had not been fully engaged when the collapse began. Its commander, recognizing the scale of disaster unfolding across the battlefield, ordered an immediate withdrawal. It was not a victory, but it was survival. Even so, the retreat was harried, with Ethiopian forces pressing relentlessly. General Baratieri had no choice but to retreat with what remained of his command. There was no possibility of regrouping or counterattack. The Ethiopian army controlled the high ground, the valleys, and the initiative. The campaign was over. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 6,000 Italian and colonial troops lay dead on the battlefield. Thousands more were wounded. Nearly 3,000 were captured. Entire regiments had been wiped out. Multiple general officers were dead or prisoners. For a European army of the era, the losses were almost unimaginable. Ethiopian casualties were heavy as well. Estimates vary, but between 7,000 and 10,000 Ethiopian warriors were killed or wounded. These losses were deeply felt. Each fallen man represented a family, a community, a region that had sacrificed for survival. Victory did not erase grief. It only gave it meaning. As fighting ceased, Menelik faced an immediate and complex challenge. Victory brought responsibility. The battlefield was littered with wounded men from both sides. Ethiopian medical attendants moved among the fallen, treating injuries as best they could. Italian wounded received care alongside Ethiopian soldiers, a fact that would later astonish European observers. The question of prisoners loomed largest. Feeding, guarding, and transporting thousands of captives was a logistical nightmare. Ethiopian forces were already stretched thin. Some voices called for execution, arguing that prisoners would only return to fight again. Others feared that harsh treatment would invite European retaliation or intervention. Menelik's decision was calculated and deliberate. Italian prisoners would be treated humanely. Food was distributed. Medical care was provided where possible. Officers were allowed to retain personal possessions. The message was clear. Ethiopia was not a barbaric force acting out of vengeance, but a sovereign power observing the norms of war as it understood them. The world was watching, and Menelik intended to control the narrative. There was, however, a crucial distinction. Eritrean Askari who had fought for Italy were treated differently. In Ethiopian tradition, Africans who fought for foreign colonizers against their own people were considered traitors. Many were punished harshly, mutilated according to long-standing customs of wartime justice. European observers were horrified. Ethiopian leaders were unmoved. To them, loyalty was not negotiable. Over the following days, Italian prisoners were marched southward toward the Ethiopian heartland. The journey was arduous, but most survived. Their presence in Ethiopia became a powerful bargaining tool, one that Menelik would later use to extract formal recognition of Ethiopian sovereignty. Meanwhile, the shock of defeat rippled outward. Survivors carried news back to Eritrea, then across the Mediterranean. Telegraphs transmitted fragments at first, confusion, disbelief, rumors. Surely this could not be correct. European armies did not lose wars to African states in open battle. But the truth could not be contained. Within weeks, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Italy had not suffered a setback. It had suffered a catastrophe. And with that realization, the consequences of Adwa moved beyond the battlefield, into the realms of politics, diplomacy, and global consciousness, where the meaning of the victory would prove just as disruptive as the battle itself. News of the defeat traveled faster than understanding. At first, reports reaching Europe were confused, contradictory, and cautiously phrased. Telegraph operators transmitted fragments from Eritrea, mentions of heavy losses, of retreats, of missing units. Editors hesitated. Governments waited. Surely there had been some mistake. African armies did not annihilate European ones. That was not how the modern world worked. But as survivors reached the coast and their testimonies aligned, denial collapsed. Italy had not lost a skirmish. It had suffered one of the worst military disasters in its national history. In Rome, shock turned rapidly into fury. The public had been promised prestige, empire, and easy victory. Instead, it received mass graves and humiliation. Crowds gathered in the streets. Newspapers that had celebrated colonial expansion now demanded accountability. Parliament erupted into accusations. Within days, Prime Minister Francesco Crispi's government fell. His nationalist vision, once celebrated, was now blamed for reckless ambition and needless death. The Italian military searched for scapegoats. General Baratieri was recalled and placed under investigation. Though later acquitted of the most serious charges, his career was finished. He became a symbol of failure, an officer who had hesitated too long and then acted too late. For the families of the dead, legal outcomes mattered little. Their sons were gone, sacrificed for an empire that never materialized. King Umberto I, whose approval had enabled the campaign, faced public criticism unlike anything earlier in his reign. The monarchy survived, but the illusion of national competence was deeply damaged. For decades, Adwa would remain an open wound in Italian political memory, a reminder of ambition outrunning reality. Elsewhere in Europe, reactions were more complex. Britain and France expressed official sympathy while privately reassessing their assumptions. Italy's defeat removed a rival from serious contention in the Horn of Africa, but it also introduced an unsettling precedent. If Ethiopia could do this, what might other societies achieve under different circumstances? The lesson was uncomfortable, and it was quietly absorbed rather than openly discussed. Germany's response was colder, more analytical. Military observers studied reports carefully. The defeat was not dismissed as racial anomaly or fluke. It was treated as a case study. An African state with modern weapons, unified command, and favorable terrain had defeated a European army. Future colonial campaigns, German planners concluded, would require overwhelming force, faster mobilization, and total dominance. Adwa became a warning, not to abandon empire, but to pursue it more ruthlessly. Russia reacted differently. As an Orthodox Christian power, it felt cultural sympathy with Ethiopia. Newspapers praised Ethiopian discipline and leadership. Menelik was portrayed not as a curiosity, but as a legitimate ruler who had defended his nation against deception and aggression. Diplomatic ties strengthened. Ethiopia's victory resonated as a moral as well as strategic success. Yet the most profound reactions occurred far from Europe's capitals. Across Africa, Asia, and the African diaspora, Adwa shattered something that had long seemed immovable. Colonial ideology depended not only on guns and laws, but on belief. The belief that resistance was futile, that European dominance was natural, and that history moved in only one direction. Adwa broke that spell. In colonized territories, people read what they could about the battle. Details mattered less than the outcome. An African army had defeated a European one, not through ambush, not through luck, but through planning, discipline, and numbers. That fact alone was revolutionary. In India, early nationalist thinkers discussed the implications. Ethiopia had not waited for European permission to modernize. It had not relied on a single foreign patron. It had unified internally before confronting external power. These lessons lingered in political conversations long before independence movements gained mass momentum. In the Caribbean and the Americas, communities of African descent reacted with pride and astonishment. Haiti, itself born from a slave revolt against European empire, recognized the significance immediately. Newspapers drew direct parallels between Haitian independence and Ethiopian victory. History, it seemed, had repeated itself, this time on African soil. Among African-American intellectuals, Adwa became a reference point. It offered evidence against racist narratives that framed people of African descent as incapable of organization or self-rule. Scholars, writers, and activists pointed to Ethiopia as proof that oppression was not destiny. Menelik understood this global moment instinctively, even if he could not yet see its full reach. His victory was not only military. It was symbolic. Ethiopia was no longer merely independent. It was undeniable. And yet, victory carried obligations. Ethiopia now stood exposed on the world stage. European powers would watch its next moves carefully, measuring whether the empire could translate battlefield success into lasting political security. Menelik knew that a single battle, no matter how decisive, would not protect Ethiopia forever. Recognition had to be formal. Borders had to be secured. Independence had to be written into international law, not just defended by arms. The battle had ended. The struggle to define its meaning had only just begun. Victory on the battlefield meant little if it could not be secured at the negotiating table. Menelik II understood this better than any of his adversaries. Ethiopia's triumph at Adwa had shattered assumptions, but assumptions could reform. European powers might reinterpret events, minimize defeat, or wait for a moment of weakness. To ensure survival, Ethiopia's independence had to be recognized not just in practice, but in law. Italy, reeling from disaster, was in no position to dictate terms. Its army in East Africa had been destroyed. Its government had collapsed. Its public demanded an end to the humiliation. Within months, a new Italian administration sought negotiations, not conquest. Envoys were dispatched to Menelik's court with a tone radically different from that of earlier diplomacy. The talks culminated in the Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed on October 26, 1896. The terms were unequivocal. Italy formally recognized Ethiopia as a sovereign and independent state. The Treaty of Adwa was officially annulled in all versions and interpretations. Italy renounced all claims of protectorate status and acknowledged that Ethiopia controlled its own foreign policy without limitation. Borders between Ethiopia and Italian-held Eritrea were defined, restricting Italy to its original coastal possessions. There was no symbolic submission, no concession of authority, no veiled language. The treaty was signed as an agreement between equals. For the first time in the modern colonial era, a European power had been forced to recognize the independence of an African state as the result of military defeat. This was not a temporary truce or an ambiguous arrangement. It was a formal acknowledgement that Ethiopia existed outside the colonial order. The practical implications were immediate. European governments could no longer treat Ethiopia as unclaimed or disputed territory without violating an internationally recognized treaty. Arms dealers were free to sell to Ethiopia. Diplomats were required to engage directly with Addis Ababa. Ethiopia's legal status within the global system had been transformed. Menelik moved quickly to consolidate these gains. Diplomatic relations were established with major powers across Europe and beyond. Ethiopian envoys were sent abroad. Foreign embassies opened in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia entered the international arena not as a subject of curiosity, but as a recognized state navigating global politics on its own terms. Economic strategy followed diplomacy. Menelik invited foreign expertise, but not foreign control. Engineers were contracted to build roads, bridges, and telegraph lines, all under Ethiopian authority. A railway connecting Addis Ababa to the port of Djibouti was commissioned, providing access to global trade without reliance on Italian-controlled territory. The project was expensive and controversial, but transformative. Ethiopia was no longer isolated by geography alone. Education became another pillar of independence. Modern schools were established alongside traditional institutions, teaching mathematics, science, and foreign languages. Menelik understood that future security required administrators, engineers, and officers capable of engaging with a changing world. Independence had to be maintained intellectually as well as militarily. The army, too, was reorganized. Traditional structures were preserved, but modern training and equipment became standard. Officers studied European tactics. Weapons were purchased from multiple suppliers to avoid dependence on any single power. Ethiopia would never again be caught unprepared. Throughout this period, Empress Teitu remained a central figure. She influenced diplomatic decisions, managed court politics, and represented Ethiopian interests to foreign visitors. European diplomats were often surprised to find negotiations conducted not by the emperor alone, but by a partnership that reflected Ethiopian political reality rather than European expectation. Yet beneath this success lay unresolved tensions. Ethiopia's expansion during Menelik's reign brought new territories and peoples under imperial control. Some were incorporated through negotiation, others through force. Modern scholars continue to debate whether these campaigns constituted defensive consolidation or imperial conquest. For Menelik, the calculus was clear. A fragmented Ethiopia would invite future invasion. Security required cohesion, even when that cohesion was contested. Internally, the empire remained complex. Regional autonomy persisted. Succession was uncertain. Menelik had no surviving sons, and questions about the future of the throne lingered. Stability depended heavily on his personal authority and political skill. Still, in the decade following Adwa, Ethiopia stood as something extraordinary, an African state that had not only resisted colonization, but had compelled the world to acknowledge that resistance as legitimate. The victory had been secured, the treaty signed, and the empire strengthened. But history rarely allows triumph to remain unchallenged. Menelik's health began to fail in the early years of a new century. As his strength waned, old rivalries resurfaced. Court factions maneuvered. The unity forged in war was tested by peace. Ethiopia had survived external threat, but whether it could navigate internal transition remained uncertain. The legacy of Adwa was secure. The future, once again, was not. Triumph does not end history. It reshapes it. In the years following Adwa, Ethiopia stood taller than it ever had before, but it also stood exposed. The very victory that preserved independence intensified internal pressures, raised expectations, and revealed fractures that had been temporarily sealed by war. Menelik II had defeated a European empire, but he could not defeat time. By the early 1900s, the emperor's health began to deteriorate. A series of strokes gradually limited his mobility and clouded his judgment. Public appearances became rare. Decisions once made decisively were delayed or delegated. In a political system that relied heavily on personal authority, this decline created uncertainty at the heart of the state. Power did not disappear, it shifted. Court politics intensified as factions maneuvered for influence. Regional leaders, long loyal to Menelik, began recalculating their positions. Some sought to secure autonomy. Others aimed to shape the succession. Ethiopia had survived external domination, but internal rivalry, never fully extinguished, returned quietly and persistently. At the center of this struggle stood Empress Teitu. During Menelik's rise and the war against Italy, Teitu had been indispensable. Organizer, strategist, diplomat, and symbol of resistance. In the emperor's weakened state, she attempted to preserve stability, acting as regent in practice if not always in name. She managed court affairs, mediated disputes, and worked to protect Menelik's legacy. But Teitu's power provoked opposition. Many nobles resented her influence, particularly those excluded from decision-making during the war years. Others viewed her uncompromising nationalism as a liability in a world where diplomacy required subtlety. Foreign diplomats, uncomfortable with a woman wielding such authority, quietly supported factions more willing to accommodate European interests. Succession became the most dangerous fault line. Menelik had no surviving sons with Teitu. His designated heir was his grandson, Lige Iyasu, a young man whose temperament and political instincts troubled many within the court. Iyasu's religious openness, unconventional behavior, and unpredictable alliances alarmed both traditional elites and foreign observers. Some feared he would undermine the delicate balance Menelik had achieved. As Menelik's condition worsened, rival factions acted. In 1910, a palace coup effectively sidelined Tedu, forcing her into political retirement. Authority passed to a regency council ruling in Menelik's name. The emperor remained alive but incapacitated, a symbol rather than an actor. Ethiopia entered a period of uneasy transition, governed by compromise rather than conviction. Menelik died on December 12, 1913. His death marked the end of an era defined by strategic patience, calculated modernization, and defiant independence. The empire he left behind was stronger than any Ethiopian state before it, but also more complex, more centralized, and more contested. Lige Iyasu succeeded briefly, but his reign proved unstable. Within 3 years, he was deposed. Out of the resulting turmoil emerged a young nobleman named Ras Tafari Makoan. In 1916, he became regent. In 1930, he would be crowned emperor under the name Haile Selassie. Ethiopia endured, but the world around it was changing again. In Europe, the memory of Adwa did not fade. It fermented. Italian nationalism never forgot the humiliation of 1896. When Benito Mussolini rose to power in 1922, he inherited not only a fascist ideology obsessed with empire, but a historical grievance that demanded resolution. To Mussolini, Ethiopia was unfinished business. Throughout the early 1930s, Italy prepared carefully. This time there would be no underestimation, no divided columns, no reliance on outdated assumptions. Italy mobilized overwhelming force, tanks, aircraft, heavy artillery. Chemical weapons were stockpiled despite international bans. Logistics were planned meticulously. The goal was not prestige through victory, but erasure through domination. On October 3, 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The war that followed was brutal and asymmetrical. Ethiopian forces fought with courage and determination, but the world of 1935 was not the world of 1896. Air power shattered concentrations. Poison gas burned villages and fields. International institutions proved powerless. The League of Nations condemned Italy in words, then allowed the conquest in practice. In May 1936, Italian troops entered Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie went into exile. Ethiopia was occupied. For 5 years, fascist rule attempted to crush Ethiopian identity through repression and terror. Intellectuals, clergy, and suspected resistance leaders were targeted. Entire communities were punished. But occupation did not mean submission. Resistance never ceased. Guerrilla fighters controlled the countryside, even as Italy held cities and roads. In 1941, global war altered the balance once again. British and Commonwealth forces, supported by Ethiopian resistance fighters, dismantled Italian East Africa. Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa on May 5th, exactly 5 years after his flight into exile. Ethiopia was liberated. The victory of Adwa had not prevented occupation forever, but it had made occupation temporary. That distinction mattered. Ethiopia emerged from the 20th century not as a nation reborn from colonization, but as one that had endured interruption without erasure. Its institutions, faith, and identity survived. Its sovereignty, once proven possible, was reclaimed. Adwa had not guaranteed a peaceful future, but it had ensured that Ethiopia's future would always be its own to fight for. With distance, Adwa reveals itself as more than a single battle or even a single victory. It was a rupture in a global system that depended on inevitability. Colonialism did not survive on force alone. It survived on the belief that resistance was futile, that European domination was the natural endpoint of history. Adwa shattered that belief, and once broken, it could never be fully restored. Historians have long asked a difficult question: why Ethiopia succeeded where so many other African states failed? The answer is not comforting, nor is it simple. Ethiopia did not prevail because others lacked courage. Across the continent, resistance movements fought with extraordinary bravery, from the Zulu in southern Africa to the Ashanti in West Africa, from the Mahdi estate in Sudan to countless local wars that never entered European textbooks. Courage was never the missing ingredient. What distinguished Adwa was convergence. Geography played a role. Ethiopia's highlands are difficult terrain for invading armies. Supply lines stretched thin. Local forces knew every ridge and pass. But geography alone never guarantees victory. The Zulu kingdom also fought on familiar ground and still fell. Terrain shapes outcomes. It does not determine them. Leadership mattered profoundly. Menelik II was not merely a charismatic ruler or a battlefield commander. He was a strategic thinker who understood Europe as well as Ethiopia. He grasped the nature of imperial rivalry, the value of diplomacy, and the importance of delay. He prepared for years, not months. He did not mistake provocation for opportunity. When war came, it came on his terms. Equally vital was unity. Ethiopia was not a nation-state in the modern sense, but it achieved something functionally equivalent when it mattered most. Regional leaders subordinated rivalry to survival. Religious identity provided cohesion. Political compromise replaced fragmentation. Many African states fell not because they were weak, but because they were divided at the moment unity was required. Adwa demonstrated the power of coordinated resistance on a national scale. Access to modern weapons was decisive. Menelik exploited European rivalries to acquire rifles and artillery in quantities few African rulers ever managed. Other kingdoms possessed firearms, but rarely in sufficient numbers or with the logistical support to sustain large-scale conflict. Ethiopia did not match Europe technologically, but it closed the gap enough to make numbers and terrain decisive. Timing was critical. Adwa occurred at a narrow moment in history, late enough for modern weapons to be available, early enough that European powers had not yet committed overwhelming industrial force to East Africa. A decade later, air power and mechanized warfare would change the equation. A decade earlier, Ethiopia might not have been ready. History rarely offers such narrow windows. Above all, Adwa was won through patience. Menelik refused to fight prematurely. He absorbed provocation without reaction. He endured deception without retaliation. He waited while Ethiopia armed, unified, and prepared. Many resistance movements elsewhere were forced into battle before they were ready, reacting to encroachment rather than choosing confrontation. Adwa proved that restraint could be as powerful as aggression. The consequences extended far beyond Ethiopia. For colonized peoples across the world, Adwa introduced possibility. It did not promise victory, but it disproved inevitability. European armies could be beaten. Colonial systems could fail. Modernity was not owned by Europe alone. These ideas spread quietly but persistently through intellectual circles, political movements, and popular imagination. Pan-Africanism drew strength from Adwa. Ethiopia became a symbol not because it was perfect, but because it endured. Its flag colors, green, yellow, and red, were adopted across the continent as emblems of resistance and continuity. Independence movements of the mid-20th century invoked Ethiopia's example as proof that sovereignty was achievable. In the African diaspora, Adwa carried emotional weight. For communities shaped by slavery, segregation, and colonialism, Ethiopia represented unbroken lineage. The idea that an African state had stood, fought, and won against Europe resonated across generations. Thinkers, activists, and artists returned to Adwa as a counter-narrative to imposed inferiority. Even European military planners internalized the lesson. Adwa did not end colonialism. In some ways, it hardened it. Future conquests were pursued with greater brutality, overwhelming force, and less restraint. The defeat taught empires not humility, but caution. The price of conquest will be higher than assumed. That, too, was part of Adwa's legacy. It exposed the truth that colonial domination was not destiny, but a choice, one enforced through violence when resistance proved effective. The myth of racial hierarchy could not survive contact with Ethiopian discipline and strategy. Once exposed, it had to be defended more aggressively, revealing its own fragility. Adwa did not save Africa from colonization, but it ensured that colonization could never claim to be inevitable, natural, or uncontested again. That is why it still matters.